Imagine a quiet medieval court bathed in candlelight. Velvet drapes hush the sound of the wind outside. A fire crackles. And there, in the center, stands a girl of 15, intelligent, poised, and destined to change the course of European history, not through war, but through will. Not through power granted, but power claimed. Tonight, let's begin a story that defies the silence of time. A tale not of knights and kings, but of a queen who refused to disappear behind the curtain of history. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was born around the year 1122, a time when the world belonged to men, and queens were expected to serve in the background. But Eleanor would become Queen of France, Queen of England, and the mother of two legendary kings. Her voice, her choices, and her defiance would echo through 3 generations of rulers. Yet for all her titles, it is not her crowns that define her, but her refusal to be silent. She came into the world in the sunlit courts of Aquitaine, in what is now southwestern France, a land rich in vineyards, rivers, and poetry. Her father, William X, was Duke of Aquitaine, a ruler of vast lands and even vaster influence. Unlike many noble daughters of the age, Eleanor was not merely raised for marriage. She was educated, intensely. She read Latin, understood Roman law, and was immersed in the chivalric traditions of her region. Her court would later become a cradle for the ideals of romantic love and courtly elegance, but that would come later. For now, she was a daughter born to rule. When she was just 15, her life changed abruptly. Her father, on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, fell gravely ill. His death was sudden, and with it, Eleanor inherited the title of Duchess of Aquitaine. At an age when most girls were still learning to sew and recite prayers, she held command over nearly a third of what is now France. It was an inheritance of immense power and immense danger. For a young, unmarried duchess was a prize too tempting for kings to ignore. It didn't take long for the French crown to act. Within weeks, Eleanor was married to Louis, the heir to the French throne. It was a strategic union, meant not for love but for consolidation. The crown saw a chance to fold Aquitaine into its grasp. But Eleanor was no docile bride. Shortly after their marriage, King Louis VI died. Her husband ascended the throne as King Louis VII. Eleanor, now Queen of France, entered a royal court that was dour, restrained, and deeply religious. Everything her upbringing in Aquitaine had not been. Where Eleanor was bold and cultured, Louis was austere and uncertain. Their personalities clashed like fire and snow. In Paris, Eleanor's presence caused a stir. She brought with her a lively entourage and a love for music, art, and open conversation. The French court, bound in tradition and piety, whispered about her independence. But Eleanor didn't mind. She knew her worth. And she intended to be more than just decoration in the royal tapestry. When the Second Crusade was declared in 1147, King Louis felt the weight of divine obligation. He would take up the cross, as many Christian rulers did, to reclaim lost cities in the East. But what no one expected was Eleanor's announcement. She would go too. Queens didn't ride to war. But Eleanor wasn't just a queen. She led hundreds of knights from Aquitaine, many of them loyal only to her. Even more shockingly, she brought with her a company of noble women dressed in armor, ready to accompany the men into battle. Chroniclers of the time were scandalized. They mocked her as an Amazon queen, accused her of vanity and recklessness. But Eleanor was undeterred. She knew the risk. And she also knew that sometimes presence alone is power. The journey across Europe was brutal. A march through harsh terrain, disease, and dwindling morale. Louis proved a poor commander. And the further they traveled, the more evident the cracks in their marriage became. In the eastern city of Antioch, Eleanor found solace in the court of her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. Charismatic and politically astute, Raymond treated her as an equal, a rare experience. Whispers spread that their bond was more than familial. Whether true or not, the rumors were enough. Louis became enraged. He ordered Eleanor to leave Antioch at once. She protested. He insisted that their marriage, already strained, now fractured beyond repair, when they returned from the disastrous crusade. The distance between them was not just emotional, it was political. They had 2 daughters, but no sons. They disagreed on everything from strategy to ceremony. And Eleanor, tired of compromise, sought an annulment. The church granted it on the grounds of consanguinity, blood relation, though that was hardly the real reason. What mattered was this: Eleanor kept her lands and her freedom. Most noble women would have retired quietly into obscurity. Eleanor did not. Just 8 weeks later, she shocked Europe again. She married Henry, Duke of Anjou, a man 11 years her junior, ambitious, daring, and destined to become King of England. It was a bold move, both romantic and strategic. With Eleanor's lands and Henry's claim to the English throne, the union created an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. France found itself surrounded. And at the very heart of it all was Eleanor. She was no longer merely a duchess, no longer just a consort. She was the hinge upon which the fate of kingdoms turned, and this was only the beginning. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story did not slow when she became Queen of England. If anything, it gained momentum, depth, and a shadowed brilliance. Her marriage to Henry, Duke of Anjou, just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis of France, had stunned Europe. 11 years her junior, Henry was bold, relentless, and already carving out a claim to the English crown. When he ascended as Henry II, Eleanor became queen once more, not merely in name but as the sovereign of an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the sunlit slopes of the Pyrenees. It was an alliance of land, ambition, and sheer will. At first, their rule seemed unshakable. Together, they represented a new political powerhouse, a queen who brought with her the richest duchy in France, and a king with an appetite for order, control, and legacy. Eleanor governed actively in his absence, her signature found on royal charters, her presence respected across both English and French courts. Her court in Poitiers became a place of poetry, song, and refinement, a cultural jewel where ideas of chivalry and romantic love flourished. She encouraged the troubadours, welcomed thinkers and poets, and created a space where intellect was prized as much as lineage. In these early years, she was not merely Henry's consort, she was his political partner. And yet, behind the elegance and success, small cracks began to form. Henry, for all his brilliance, was a difficult man, restless, domineering, and increasingly unable to share power, even with the woman who helped him seize it. He expected loyalty without question, obedience without resistance. Eleanor, who had never been silent in any court, found herself increasingly pushed aside. The queen who had once led troops and ruled territories was now treated more like a vessel for heirs than a ruler in her own right. As the years passed, their marriage began to sour, slowly at first, then with quickening tension. Henry's public affair with Rosamond Clifford, a young noblewoman cloistered in a tower surrounded by roses, became a humiliating emblem of Eleanor's diminished place in his heart and court. Though she did not retaliate with words or gestures, her silence was anything but surrender. She endured with the cold patience of someone who had known power and would one day reclaim it. Still, Eleanor was not idle. She brokered marriages for their children, cultivated political alliances, and monitored the rising unrest within their family. She had borne Henry 5 sons and 3 daughters. Among them were Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, each bold, willful, and impatient in his own way. To secure succession and appease the nobility, Henry crowned their eldest son while still alive, naming him Henry the young king. But it was a coronation in title only. The young Henry was given no lands, no authority, and no real independence. The gesture, meant to ensure continuity, only bred resentment. The boy chafed under his father's control. His younger brothers followed suit. Geoffrey, cunning and politically savvy, resented being sidelined. Richard, proud and fearless, saw his inheritance in Aquitaine as his own to govern. And John, the youngest, watched and waited, learning from everyone's mistakes. By the early 1170s, the family had become a royal tinderbox. Henry II, so intent on keeping power centralized, refused to delegate meaningful authority to his sons. In doing so, he created a court rife with suspicion, jealousy, and quiet rage. Eleanor, who had once brokered peace between kingdoms, now found herself in the center of a storm forming within her own bloodline. And then, she made her most dangerous move yet. In 1173, Eleanor encouraged three of her sons, Henry the Young, King Richard, and Geoffrey, to rise in rebellion against their father. She understood what she was doing. This was not a mere family quarrel. This was a coordinated revolt, backed by the King of France and powerful barons eager to unseat the aging king. Eleanor's motivations were many: to protect her children's futures, to challenge her husband's growing tyranny, and perhaps to reclaim the influence that had been stripped from her. She used every skill she had: letters sent in secret, alliances forged across provinces, networks of vassals mobilized into action. For a moment, it seemed the rebellion might succeed. Henry II was caught off guard. His territories were attacked from all sides. But he responded with the ferocity of a man who had built his kingdom from nothing. His counteroffensive was swift and ruthless. The rebellion began to collapse. Young Henry faltered in command, more figurehead than leader. Geoffrey negotiated partial peace. Even Richard, who fought fiercely, could not overcome the momentum of his father's army. And then came the betrayal Henry would never forgive. Eleanor, attempting to flee Aquitaine in disguise, was captured by royal forces. She was brought to Henry in England, not as a queen or consort, but as a traitor. There was no public trial, no dramatic confrontation. Henry chose silence. He placed her under house arrest, confining her to various castles for what would become 16 long years. She was not tortured or publicly shamed, but she was erased from courtly life. For a woman like Eleanor, such silence was its own form of cruelty. And yet, she bore it with the same resilience that had carried her through the Crusades, through 2 royal marriages, and through the volatile maze of medieval politics. She did not beg. She did not plead. She waited. Within her confinement, she watched her sons grow, squabble, and vie for influence. She knew their strengths. She understood their flaws. She knew that Henry's iron grip could not hold forever. Time was a patient ally. The empire they had built together was fraying. The family was breaking under its own weight. And in the quiet solitude of stone walls and shuttered windows, Eleanor prepared for the moment she knew would come, the moment when history would turn once more in her favor. For 16 years, Eleanor of Aquitaine waited behind castle walls, her life confined to the silence of stone corridors and shuttered windows. She had been a queen, a ruler, a mother of kings, and now she was a prisoner, watched, shifted from one fortress to another, her voice muted but never extinguished. The world thought her removed, forgotten perhaps, but Eleanor was never idle. In those years of confinement, she endured not with bitterness, but with patience. She read, she reflected, she wrote letters carefully worded and cautiously sent. She listened. And most of all, she remembered who she was. Her kingdom might have been divided, but her spirit remained whole. Time, she knew, had a way of shifting loyalties and turning tides. She had survived wars, betrayal, exile, and disgrace. She would survive this too. And then, as if the world remembered her once more, everything began to change. In 1183, her son Henry the young king, once the hope of a dynasty, died of dysentery while on campaign. His rebellion had failed, and now so had his body. Though Eleanor had once supported his uprising against their father, the grief was real. A son was still a son. His death cracked the illusion of Henry II's perfect control. With the eldest gone, the delicate balance between the remaining heirs shifted. Richard, Eleanor's favorite, bold and unyielding, stepped forward. He demanded Aquitaine, his mother's duchy, not as a gift, but as a right. Henry II hesitated, suspicious of everyone, even his own blood. He preferred John, the youngest, pliable and still within reach of paternal command. But Richard would not be denied, and Eleanor, even from her captivity, supported him with whatever voice she could manage. The conflict escalated until, in 1189, Richard led a final revolt against his father. Henry II, aging and worn from years of battle and betrayal, could no longer hold his realm together. Abandoned by his allies, outmaneuvered by his son, and weakened by illness, the once mighty king crumbled. He died in July of that year, bitter and broken, betrayed by the very sons he had tried to control. With his death, Richard ascended the throne as King Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, and one of his first acts was to set his mother free. After 16 years of forced silence, Eleanor emerged from the shadows. She was nearly 70. Now, but age had not diminished her will. Her return was not marked by vengeance or fury, but by an unshakable calm. Richard knew her value. He appointed her as regent in his absence, entrusting her with authority over the English realm while he pursued the Third Crusade. In that moment, Eleanor was more than a queen mother. She was once again the center of power, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. As regent, Eleanor moved swiftly. She crossed England, gathering nobles, securing alliances, and organizing her son's coronation. Her mere presence brought stability to regions on the brink of revolt. She listened to grievances, settled disputes, and in court after court, her name carried the weight of both law and legacy. She arranged strategic marriages not for love but for diplomacy. Her daughters and granddaughters became queens and duchesses, woven into the political fabric of Europe with her hands guiding every thread. In her 70s, Eleanor ruled with a precision and resolve that many young monarchs never achieved. But peace never lasted long in a Plantagenet world. In 1192, word reached England that Richard had been captured on his way home from the crusade, seized by Duke Leopold of Austria, and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. He was imprisoned, held for a ransom so massive it could have bankrupted any kingdom. Most rulers would have faltered, lost their throne, or vanished into legend as a cautionary tale. But Richard had Eleanor. She did not hesitate. Despite the dangers of travel and the weight of years upon her, Eleanor crossed the Alps in winter, riding through wind and snow to plead, negotiate, and maneuver her son's release. She met with princes, bishops, and emperors, summoned gold and silver from reluctant barons, and raised a ransom of 150,000 marks, a sum so vast it shocked the courts of Europe. And when it was paid, it was not a soldier who brought Richard home, nor a diplomat. It was his mother. The queen who had waited, watched, and endured, now stood once more with her son at her side. Richard returned, reclaimed his crown, but his years of war had taken their toll. His kingdom was weary, and so was he. Then, in 1199, while laying siege to a minor castle in Aquitaine, his mother's own land, he was wounded by a crossbow bolt. The injury turned septic, and within days, the Lionheart lay dying. He was 41. Eleanor rushed to his side, arriving in time to say goodbye. She had outlived another king, another son. With Richard's death, the crown passed to John, the youngest and most unpredictable of Eleanor's children. She had long distrusted his ambition and his temper, but she also understood the danger of division. If she did not support him, the fragile empire she had helped to build might fracture entirely. So she gave him her name, her presence, and the weight of her authority. lending legitimacy to a king few trusted. And still, Eleanor's work was not finished. In 1200, now nearly 80 years old, she journeyed once more, this time to Castile, where her granddaughter Blanche was being raised. France and England teetered on the edge of open conflict, and Eleanor had brokered one last alliance. She would bring Blanche to the French court, where the girl would marry the heir to the French throne. It was a union meant to ensure peace. However fragile between two ancient enemies, the journey was long, perilous, and through treacherous terrain. But Eleanor made it. She delivered Blanche to the court of France, watched the alliance sealed, and then quietly withdrew from the world of crowns and thrones. She returned to Fontevraud Abbey, a place she had long favored, where silence was no longer a prison but a sanctuary. There, in a quiet stone cell, she finally laid down her burdens. She died on April 1st, 1204, at approximately 82 years old. Her body was placed beside that of her husband, Henry II, and her son Richard the Lionheart. Her effigy does not show her holding a scepter or sword. Instead, she lies with a book in her hands, a silent testament to the life of the mind, to the legacy of a woman who had ruled with intelligence, patience, and a gaze that missed nothing. Eleanor of Aquitaine had worn many crowns and survived many courts. She had lived through rebellion, war, betrayal, and loss. She had outlasted kings and crowned emperors. But her legacy was not written only in bloodlines or treaties. It lived in the idea that a woman could lead, could shape history not with noise or violence, but with endurance. She had waited, and when her time came, she ruled. Not as a figurehead, not as a consort, but as a queen in every sense the word could carry, long before it became a sanctuary of silent masterpieces and camera clicks. Long before the Mona Lisa smiled her mysterious smile at thousands of curious eyes, the Louvre was something else entirely grim. Solid, vigilant. It stood not as a haven of beauty, but as a bulwark, a stronghold of fear and control, born from the anxiety of a kingdom ever uncertain of its future. In the late 12th century, King Philip Augustus ordered the construction of a fortified tower along the western edge of medieval Paris. The Seine curved like a loose thread nearby, and threats real or imagined crept along its banks. What Paris lacked in walls, Philip gave it in stone. The Louvre was not elegant, it was severe. A squat, round keep with thick walls, narrow slits for arrows, and a surrounding moat. It wasn't meant to be seen, admired, or inhabited with comfort. It was meant to last. It was meant to say, "We are ready." And in its silence, it did. The fortress watched over a growing city that still spilled mud in the rain, that stank in the summer heat, that whispered with the hum of markets, sermons, and steel. For generations, the Louvre was simply that, a presence, a precaution. Time, however, softens even the harshest intentions. By the 14th century, a different kind of king sat the throne. Charles V was not a warrior in the same mold as his predecessors. He was contemplative, deliberate, and deeply invested in the idea of continuity. To him, stone could be more than a wall. It could be memory, legacy, a home for ideas. And so he transformed the old fortress into something altogether different. He added windows where once there were none, installed chambers filled not with weapons, but with books. Tapestries replaced the chill of bare stone. For the first time in French history, a royal library was born within those walls, filled with manuscripts in Latin and French, bearing knowledge from distant shores and forgotten minds. Though the Louvre remained guarded and stern on the outside, within, a change had begun. The idea of beauty had been invited in, cautiously, like a guest not yet trusted. It wasn't yet a palace, not fully, but the seeds had been planted. Over the next 2 centuries, those seeds would slowly bloom. Each king who passed through left something behind: a new wing, a new courtyard, a new staircase carved in a softer spiral. But the Louvre was still an afterthought in royal life. France's court was famously itinerant. Kings wandered from one chateau to another, dragging their households across rivers and forests like a snail carries its shell. The Louvre, grand as it was becoming, did not yet anchor the monarchy. It was useful, impressive, but not essential. Still, stones remember. And the Louvre remembered every ruler who dared reshape its bones. It was not until the 16th century that vision met permanence. Henry IV, a king born of war and wearied by it, sought peace in design. He imagined the Louvre not as a jumble of royal apartments and disconnected wings, but as a true residence, one with purpose and elegance. He ordered the construction of the Grande Galerie, a monumental hallway stretching along the river, designed not for defense, but for display, for processions, for paintings, for the quiet luxury of permanence. His efforts began to thread together the many pieces of the Louvre into something cohesive. He had little time, though. Politics moved quickly, and even the most patient architecture could not keep pace with assassination and intrigue. Then came Louis XIII, who continued the work, but whose legacy was largely overshadowed by his son. And what a son he was! Louis XIV, the Sun King, shaped the Louvre as no one had before. He did not simply build. He orchestrated. He summoned architects like Levauve and decorators like Lebrun, men who understood that symmetry and symbolism could project divine authority. The Louvre's eastern facade, austere and classical, rose beneath their hands, a statement not of warmth, but of domination. Marble and gilded moldings now adorned what were once barracks. State apartments emerged, like polished thoughts, each room whispering of a kingdom where art and absolutism walked side by side. Yet for all this glory, Louis XIV did something unexpected. He left. He moved his court to Versailles, an even grander canvas upon which to paint his reign. The Louvre, reborn and adorned, was left behind, beautiful and silent. In the years that followed, the palace shifted roles again and again. It housed artists, administrators, academies. Painters and sculptors worked under its ceilings, their creations lining galleries that still bore the scent of royal perfumes. It was no longer a home, it was a workshop, a gallery, a waiting room for revolution. And revolution did come. The French Revolution shattered not just thrones but traditions. The people, long barred from the privileges of palace life, suddenly found themselves inside its halls. The monarchy was gone. The court had fled. And in 1793, the Louvre opened not as a royal residence, but as a museum for the people. Its artworks, seized from churches, aristocrats, and former kings, were now hung for common eyes. No longer did one need a title to stand before ancient Greek statues or Italian altarpieces. A cobbler could walk the same polished floors once reserved for dukes. A farmer's child could gaze at relics from Egypt and think not of kings, but of possibilities. The transformation was not without chaos. Revolutionary zeal had little patience for preservation. Sculptures were defaced, paintings slashed, and some treasures lost to history. But the core idea survived. Art belongs to all. The Louvre, once a fortress, then a palace, now became a sanctuary of memory, of shared humanity expressed in brushstroke and bronze. In the centuries that followed, the museum expanded. Napoleon claimed trophies from every corner of Europe and displayed them in the Louvre, swelling its collection with spoils and symbolism. Under the guidance of directors, curators, and architects, the Louvre grew not just in size, but in spirit. Its walls absorbed not only light, but history, the shifting echo of empires and revolutions, of restorations and republics. And still, it evolved. Glass met stone in the 20th century. In 1989, a glass pyramid rose in the center of its courtyard, a bold and controversial gesture designed by architect I.M. Pei. To some, it was heresy, a modern scar on a classical face. To others, it was genius, a beacon welcoming a new century. Beneath it, visitors from every nation now pass, their footsteps soft and slow, their eyes wide. The Louvre no longer belongs to kings. It belongs to time. To walk its galleries today is to walk through centuries. You pass Egyptian pharaohs, Greek gods, Roman emperors, Christian saints, Renaissance merchants, and revolutionaries. You see beauty forged in devotion, rage, fear, hope. You see yourself reflected faintly in the glass that guards each frame. The Louvre is no longer a place of power. It is a mirror. It shows us what we choose to remember, and sometimes what we forget. And so, the old fortress stands weathered, patient, watching. Its stones have held arrows and art. Its halls have known the whispers of kings and the footsteps of strangers. It has been broken and rebuilt, emptied and reborn. It does not speak, yet it tells a story louder than any voice, that no building is ever truly finished, and no history ever truly ends. Medieval justice was rarely quiet, and it was almost never kind. In a world ruled by kings and consecrated by cathedrals, punishment was not a hidden matter to be handled behind walls and whispered through courtrooms. It was spectacle. It was memory carved into flesh, penance painted in bruises and blood. To be accused of a crime in the Middle Ages was not only to face judgment, it was to enter a stage, unwilling and exposed, where the punishment served less to correct than to terrify. The village stocks were not mere wood and iron. They were declarations. The gallows in the town square did more than lift bodies. They lifted lessons. This was a society where fear was a teacher and suffering a public script written to keep others in line. From the moment one was caught, the body became a canvas for authority. Guilt, innocence, ambiguity, these were not always distinguished with care. What mattered more was the reaffirmation of order, the show of consequence, the warning that the king and God were always watching. Crimes ranged from petty theft to heresy, from gossip to rebellion, and the punishments ranged accordingly, but not necessarily in proportion. A hungry child stealing bread might lose a hand. A rumor spread about a nobleman's affair could bring the accused to the pillory. Public humiliation was a common currency. Faces exposed to rotten vegetables, insults, spittle. And then there were the harsher tools, the branding iron that marked flesh with criminal letters, the tongue piercer for liars, the iron mask for gossips, the rack that pulled bones from sockets slowly and with precision. No invention of cruelty was left unexplored. When authority felt insecure, the goal was not just retribution, it was performance. Townsfolk would gather as if for theater. Children sat on shoulders. Merchants paused their wares. Priests might offer prayers, but few looked away. Pain was public, and public was power. Perhaps one of the strangest punishments in medieval Europe was the practice of animal trials. It sounds like fable, but it was fact. Pigs were put on trial for trampling children. Dogs were accused of theft. Rats were summoned by court orders, and if they failed to appear, they were condemned in absentia. These events were not mere absurdities. They were extensions of a worldview in which everything was part of a divine hierarchy. Even beasts could offend God's law, and so they must answer for their crimes. Cloaked judges presided over these hearings. Witnesses were called. Sentences were passed, sometimes leading to the public execution of an animal dressed in human clothes. It was theater, yes, but also theology. The idea that sin, disorder, chaos could be purged, so long as it was seen to be purged. For more serious crimes, there were more serious spectacles. Heretics were burned, witches drowned or hanged, traitors quartered. Executions were events not hidden from view, but displayed with careful ritual. The condemned were paraded through the streets. The tools of their punishment, rope, fire, blade, were laid bare. They often had the chance to speak, to confess, to beg, or to accuse. Some offered forgiveness, others curses. Some sang hymns as flames climbed their feet. These were not just punishments, they were transformations, turning criminals into examples, into memories, into stories passed down in whispers. And in those whispers, authority lived on. One of the more gruesome punishments reserved for regicide and high treason was drawing and quartering. The process began with dragging the condemned by horse through the streets, a final humiliation. Before death. Then came the hanging, not until death, but just before. The body was cut down while still alive. Disembowelment followed. The entrails were burned while the victim watched. The heart was torn out. The body was then beheaded, and the remaining pieces 4/4 sent to different parts of the kingdom, displayed on spikes as a final scattered warning. These horrors were rare, but remembered. They served their purpose. In lands where literacy was low, fear served as scripture. Stories of such ends traveled faster than royal messengers. Not all punishments were mortal. Some were psychological. The shaming stool for women who spoke too freely. The scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head, complete with a spiked bit that pressed into the tongue, was designed to silence. The ducking stool, used mostly for suspected witches or outspoken women, was less lethal but equally humiliating. Strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, the accused would be dunked repeatedly into a river. It was cold, degrading, and in winter, sometimes fatal. But it wasn't just the water, it was the eyes watching. The laughter, the judgment. Punishment wasn't always about pain. Sometimes it was about isolation, degradation, the crushing weight of being made less than human in front of those who had once been peers. Behind these rituals of justice was an uneasy alliance between the church and the state. While kings ruled lands and armies, the church ruled minds and souls. Together, they created a legal system that blended canon law and royal decree. The church offered confession and repentance mercy, if earned, but also sanctioned violence against the deviant and the damned. Religious courts could condemn as swiftly as secular ones, and sometimes more viciously. Heresy was considered worse than treason, for it threatened not just the realm, but eternity. The Inquisition, in its various forms, spread across Europe with slow, meticulous terror. Interrogations were long and agonizing. The accused were often denied legal counsel. Torture was not hidden, it was codified. Approved, sanctified, done in the name of salvation. It is perhaps no surprise that many confessed. They would say anything, name anyone, just to end the pain. And in doing so, the machinery rolled on. What's striking is not just the cruelty, but the normalcy. These punishments were not considered unusual. They were ordinary. They were part of the expected rhythm of life. Children grew up watching executions. Elders retold stories of strange deaths and miraculous survivals. Travelers remembered towns by the gallows they had seen along the road. There were customs and feasts around punishment days. Food sold to crowds, songs composed about famous hangings. Even artwork reflected it. Woodcuts and tapestries showed criminals meeting their end in vivid detail. Justice for the medieval mind was not a private reckoning. It was a community event. A reminder that safety came from submission, and that the line between citizen and criminal was thin, shifting, and dangerous to test. Yet not all was darkness. There were also pardons, reprieves, acts of mercy that came from kings or nobles seeking favor or redemption. A nobleman might commute a sentence with the wave of a hand. A priest might intervene on behalf of a repentant soul. And over time, as kingdoms grew more centralized and law more standardized, the more arbitrary cruelties began to recede. The Enlightenment would one day question the morality of public executions, of torture, of state-sanctioned terror. But in the medieval world, these were not questions yet asked. To us now, these punishments seem barbaric, surreal, impossible. But for those who lived under cathedral shadows and castle towers, they were reminders carved in daily life. The stocks reminded you to mind your tongue. The gallows reminded you to pay your taxes. The flames reminded you to keep your faith in line. These were not warnings shouted in haste. They were carved, painted, chained, and burned. And in that strange silence that followed each scream, there was a message that order would be preserved, even if humanity was not. In the medieval world, monsters were not mere fictions confined to bedtime stories or artistic margins. They were part of the landscape, embedded in the way people understood their world, stitched into the edges of maps with curling claws and gaping jaws. They lived in the woods that no one dared enter after dark, in the waters where ships vanished without reason, and sometimes they lived closer behind the eyes of a stranger, in the silence of a birthmark or the cry of a deformed child. These were not curiosities, they were signs. The natural world was believed to be filled with meaning, and where modern thought searches for causes, medieval minds searched for symbols. Every monster had a message, every strange occurrence a divine warning or punishment. This was not fantasy. This was theology in flesh. To encounter something unusual, an unfamiliar animal, an illness, a sudden storm was to enter a space where spiritual and physical merged. If a child was born with extra fingers, people did not speak of genetics. They whispered of sin. If a cow gave birth to a two-headed calf, it was not biology, it was an omen. The monstrous was rarely random. It was proof that something in the divine order had been disturbed. And so, monsters were not just feared. They were interpreted. Monks wrote treatises on dragons. Bishops spoke of demons disguised as beggars. And chroniclers dutifully recorded sightings of wild men, dog-headed saints, and unicorns with blood that healed the wicked. Each tale, each beast, held a lesson. They reminded the faithful of temptation, pride, punishment, or the boundaries of Christian order. Bestiaries illustrated books that cataloged. Animals real and imagined were popular not because they were scientific, but because they were moral. The lion symbolized Christ, noble and silent. The pelican was said to pierce its own breast to feed its young, a gesture of sacrifice. The unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin, and thus became a symbol of purity and the Virgin Mary. But not all creatures were redemptive. The basilisk, a serpent so poisonous its very gaze could kill, was linked to Satan. The manticore, with a lion's body, a human face, and a tail of venomous spines, was seen as a warning against deceit. These creatures were not decorations, they were theological illustrations, offering medieval readers a menagerie of spiritual guidance. But beyond the page, there was fear, deep, bone-rooted fear. Forests were dense, unlit, and filled with sounds that had no names. Disease came without warning or cure. People disappeared and were never found. In such a world, monsters made sense. They explained what could not be explained. They made chaos feel intentional. And this is where folklore met reality. Villagers told stories of shapeshifters who slipped into homes at night, of black dogs whose glowing eyes signaled death, of witches who could summon tempests or twist a man's bones with a glance. These were not distant myths. They were warnings. They were reasons to stay home after sunset, to nail horseshoes above doorways, to keep salt in your pocket and iron near your bed. Some of the most persistent monsters were those that blurred the line between man and beast. The werewolf, feared across much of Europe, was believed to be both punishment and curse. A man who gave in to savagery might be marked, his body transformed into that of a wolf under a full moon. But werewolves were not always villains. In some stories, they were cursed protectors, misunderstood guardians, or even penitent souls seeking redemption. These contradictions show how fluid medieval belief could be, how one creature could mean many things at once, depending on the teller, the listener, and the time. Giants, too, loomed large in the medieval mind. They were said to be the remnants of an older, more brutal age, perhaps descendants of Cain or the Nephilim mentioned in Scripture. Some were noble, like the giant god Magog in English legend, who fought with honor. Others were monstrous, cruel, enemies of God and man alike. Their bones, sometimes unearthed by accident, actually those of mammoths or other ancient beasts, were displayed in cathedrals and palaces as proof of their existence. These bones didn't need explanation. They confirmed what people already believed. The monstrous was not only possible, it was present. One of the most haunting medieval monsters was the changeling. In tales spread across Europe, it was believed that fairies or more sinister spirits would sometimes steal human infants and leave behind a replacement, a pale, sickly creature that looked human but was not. These changelings cried endlessly, failed to grow, and recoiled from holy objects. Explanations for conditions like autism, developmental delays, or genetic disorders were often framed through this lens. And tragically, such beliefs sometimes led to harm. Desperate families, convinced they were caring for a supernatural impostor, might abandon or even kill the child. In these moments, folklore became more than story, it became justification. A lens through which mercy was clouded by fear. Not all monsters were imagined. Some were created by the powerful to serve a purpose. Rulers and clergy would point to outsiders, Jews, heretics, foreigners, and describe them with monstrous traits. Crooked noses, hunched backs, strange diets. Foreign speech all became markers of danger. Art and sermons depicted enemies of the faith as hybrids, twisted things, less than human. These images served to dehumanize, to simplify, to make cruelty easier. If your enemy is a monster, you do not have to show them compassion. The metaphor became law, and law became action. Expulsions, pogroms, burnings, they were not always rational, but they were always justified by fear. The medieval monster was not always a beast. Sometimes it was just a person the world refused to understand. And yet, there was a strange comfort in these beliefs. Monsters gave shape to the unknown. They were the edges of the map, the shadows under the bed, the rustle in the woods. In a time when disease could wipe out villages, when famine came without warning, and when the stars themselves were unreadable signs, the idea that some force, however strange, was behind it all brought a kind of peace. It meant the world had structure, even if it was terrifying. It meant suffering had a source, and therefore perhaps a solution. You could avoid cursed places. You could follow the right rituals. You could learn the stories, pass them down, and protect your children. Superstition, in this way, was not foolishness. It was survival. And just as some monsters were feared, others were loved. Dragons appear in medieval lore not just as threats, but as challenges. Knights sought them out, not just to kill, but to prove their worth. Slaying a dragon was the pinnacle of bravery, a spiritual and physical triumph. But the dragon also changed shape depending on who told the tale. In Eastern traditions, it brought wisdom and rain. In the West, it hoarded gold and guarded ruins. Either way, it symbolized something great, something beyond comprehension. And in facing it, humans proved their courage not just to others, but to themselves. So what do these monsters mean to us now? We might look back and smile at the idea of dog-headed saints or river beasts with serpentine tails. But in doing so, we risk forgetting what they truly were. Not just figments, but frameworks. They were ways of seeing a world that was vast, unexplained, and often cruel. They gave names to fear, shape to chaos, and meaning to pain. In a world without microscopes or satellites, the monstrous helped people make sense of the ordinary and the extraordinary alike. And even today, if you listen carefully, the echoes of those monsters remain. In the way we speak of outsiders. In the shadows of our stories, in the symbols we still fear. Perhaps the monsters never left. Perhaps they just learned to wear new faces. In the medieval world, illness was never just a matter of the body. It was a conversation between the divine and the physical, a signal that something had gone wrong not only in your veins, but in your soul, your sins, or the stars. There were no antiseptics, no sterile gloves, no white coats or stethoscopes. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of viruses, no knowledge of blood types or immunity. And yet, people still suffered. And when people suffer, they seek relief. So they turn to the best knowledge they had, a complex web of ancient teachings, spiritual traditions, folk practices, and sheer hopeful improvisation. The result was a medical landscape that to modern minds seems bizarre, but to those who lived then was a lifeline. To heal was to restore balance. And balance began with humors. The theory of the four humors, inherited from Greek and Roman medicine, dominated medieval thought. The body was believed to be governed by four fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each humor had its own temperament, its own associations with seasons, elements, and even personality traits. Blood was warm and wet, associated with air and spring. Yellow bile was hot and dry, linked to fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry, tied to earth and autumn. Phlegm was cold and wet, ruled by water and winter. Health was a state of equilibrium. Among these forces, an illness meant imbalance. If you had a fever, your body had too much heat, perhaps an excess of yellow bile. If you were melancholic, you were suffering from too much black bile. These imbalances could be corrected, it was believed, through purging, bloodletting, diet, or the application of opposites. The practice of bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. Doctors, or more often barber surgeons, would cut a vein or apply leeches to draw out the excess blood they believed was causing disease. It was thought to cool the body, to release harmful vapors, and to restore harmony. Charts were made to guide this process. Certain days of the moon were better for letting blood from the arm, others from the ankle. Astrology played its part. 2. One should never bleed a patient if the moon was in a sign that governed the affected body part. For example, bleeding during the moon's stay in Aries might affect the head. It was all connected in a strange choreography of body and sky. Herbal remedies were also a cornerstone of treatment. Medieval healers, particularly monks and nuns, cultivated herb gardens filled with plants believed to possess powerful properties. Lavender for calm, sage for digestion, yarrow for wounds. Some herbs, like mandrake, were steeped in superstition. The root resembled a human figure and was said to scream when pulled from the earth, bringing death to those who heard it. Others, like valerian or comfrey, were used in poultices, teas, or ointments with careful ritual. Recipes were passed down through generations, often recorded in books called herbals, which mixed observation with magic. Instructions might include the hour of picking, the phase of the moon, or a specific prayer to be spoken aloud. But medieval healing was not confined to nature. The supernatural played a daily role. Illness could be caused by sin, and so confession was often part of treatment. If a person suffered from epilepsy, it might be interpreted as demonic possession. The cure was not rest, but exorcism. Priests might perform rituals to cast out evil spirits, invoking saints, sprinkling holy water, or even placing relics near the patient. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were common for the sick. People traveled miles to touch the bones of saints or bathe in sacred springs, hoping for miraculous cures. Some were healed, others weren't, but the act itself, the journey, the faith, the endurance was considered part of the remedy. Surgery existed, but it was crude. Without anesthesia, operations were performed with speed and strength. Trepanning, the drilling of holes into the skull, was used to treat headaches or release evil spirits. Amputations were done with saws heated in fire, not just to cut but to cauterize. Arrow wounds, sword slashes, infected abscesses, all were treated with what tools and courage the surgeon possessed. Wounds were often packed with honey, wine, or herbs to reduce infection, though no one truly understood why some methods worked and others didn't. In many ways, it was guesswork refined by repetition. And then there were the truly strange treatments, ones that seemed more like spells than science. Powdered mummy, imported from Egypt, was sold as a cure for nearly everything. It was believed that the preserved flesh of ancient kings contained mystical vitality. Some doctors prescribed eating crushed emeralds to treat the plague. Others suggested placing a live toad on a boil to draw out the poison. Urine charts were used to diagnose disease. Physicians would examine the color, smell, and even taste of a patient's urine, sometimes holding it up to sunlight in glass vials called urine flasks. There were treatments involving ground unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, snake skin, or even the breath of a virgin. Magic and medicine were not opposites. They were partners, two sides of the same uncertain coin. Hospitals in the medieval period were not primarily centers of treatment, but of care and prayer. Often run by monastic orders, they provided beds, food, and spiritual support. The goal was not always to cure, but to comfort. Patients were tended by monks and nuns who believed that caring for the sick was a form of devotion. Cleanliness varied. Some hospitals were surprisingly hygienic, with running water and separate wards. Others were little more than shelters. But in all, the spiritual health of the patient was seen as critical. Dying with a cleansed soul was sometimes more important than surviving the illness. Mental illness was deeply misunderstood. Those suffering from what we might now call schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety were often labeled as mad, touched by the moon, or cursed. Some were locked away, others subjected to rituals of purification. But not all responses were cruel. Certain monasteries took in the mentally ill with compassion, offering structure, routine, and quiet. Still, fear was common. Madness was frightening. And those who behaved strangely were sometimes thought to be dangerous or possessed. Despite the oddities, there were kernels of insight. Honey, used as an antiseptic. Willow bark, the ancestor of aspirin. Wine to clean wounds. And the emphasis on diet, rest, and balance. These are principles modern medicine still values. Medieval healers were doing their best with what they knew. They observed, experimented, remembered. They lacked microscopes, but not curiosity. They didn't understand cells, but they understood suffering. Perhaps the strangest thing is how many treatments, however absurd, were rooted in care, in intention, in the desire to help. A mother boiling herbs for her feverish child. A monk walking miles to find a particular flower. A barber surgeon trembling before cutting into a friend's infected limb. These were acts of courage as much as ignorance. And while we may smile now at the thought of leeches or lunar charts, we should not forget that behind each act was a human heart trying to preserve another. Trying to hold on to life in a world that offered so few guarantees. And in the quiet of a candlelit room, as a healer whispered a prayer over a sleeping patient, there was something deeply human, even beautiful in that care. The science may have been flawed, but the hope was real. The monastery loomed under a velvet sky, its ancient stones still steeped in the hush of night. The first glimmers of dawn crept across the horizon, casting a pale gold over the cloistered rooftops. As the mist slowly rose from the grass, soft bells echoed through the narrow corridors, summoning the brothers from their cells. They stirred from simple straw beds, wrapped in coarse robes, their movements unhurried, shaped by the rhythm of ritual. No one spoke. There was no need. Silence was not a rule here. It was the breath of the place, the unspoken language that permeated every corner. In this early hour, long before the bustle of townsfolk or the calls of farmers in the fields, the monks began their day with matins, the night prayer. Beneath the vaulted ceiling of the chapel, dimly lit by flickering candlelight, voices rose in Gregorian chant, weaving a calm that reached far beyond words. It was a music not meant for performance, but for presence, for realignment with something greater than the daily toil of life. Monasteries, in medieval times, were more than sanctuaries for prayer. They were vast ecosystems humming with activity. While many imagined monks to be isolated ascetics, their lives were deeply connected to the world, if not through physical movement, then through purpose. A monastery was a heartbeat of knowledge, medicine, agriculture, education, and spiritual guidance. Each brother within took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience and followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a detailed guide that shaped every moment from waking to sleep. This rule emphasized not suffering, but balance. Balance between prayer and labor, reflection and duty. The motto, ora et labora, pray and work, was lived fully, every day. The day unfolded like the turning of a slow wheel, marked by the canonical hours. Lauds followed matins, greeting the dawn with gratitude. Then came prime, a prayer of preparation, and terce, when the first tasks of the day began. Some monks went to the fields to tend crops or gather herbs for the infirmary. Others turned to their workshops where they brewed beer, tanned hides, made candles, or pressed olives. A few went to the scriptorium, a long room lit by narrow windows, where they bent over parchment for hours, copying texts in patient silence. There were no distractions here, no ink wasted, no words rushed. To write a single page took hours. To complete a book could take years. And yet they wrote not only scripture, but also philosophy, astronomy, medical treatises, and histories. These monks were not only preserving knowledge, they were preparing it for generations they would never meet. Sext marked the midday prayer and a pause from labor. In the refectory, monks gathered for a silent meal, eaten beneath high arches while one brother read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. The food was simple bread, cheese, legumes, but nourishing. Eating in silence wasn't just a rule. It was a way of reminding them that every action, even chewing, could be done mindfully. After the meal came none, then more work, and then vespers as the sun lowered itself over the horizon. Compline closed the day. The monks then returned to their cells, not rooms of luxury, but bare spaces with a small wooden bed, a candle, and perhaps a single personal item, a cross, a book, a worn image of the Virgin. Amid all this structure was a strange freedom. With the world outside teetering between war, famine, and disease, the monastery offered a rare sense of order. For the poor, the monastery might be the only place where they could learn to read. For the sick, it might be the only place to find consistent care. Monks maintained herb gardens with medicinal plants like sage, rosemary, and comfrey, and administered treatments based on ancient Roman texts and their own observations. Monasteries brewed tinctures, set broken bones, and comforted the dying. They could not always cure, but they could always care. For travelers, monasteries offered beds for the night, soup for the belly, and safety from the road's dangers. And for orphans or the abandoned, the monastery might mean survival. The gardens of the monastery were quiet, but not idle. Rows of vegetables, orchards of fruit trees, and hives of bees all thrived under the brothers' watchful eyes. Their work was not for profit, but for self-sustenance and charity. Some monasteries became known for their produce fine wines, hard cheeses, herbal salves, and sold the surplus to local communities, using the proceeds to care for the poor or repair roads and bridges. While some grew wealthy and strayed from their vows of poverty, others remained humble, choosing to give rather than to hoard. The seasons shaped life within the walls. In winter, the stone floors turned icy and breath clouded in the air, but fires were carefully rationed. Brothers huddled in their robes and prayed with chapped lips. In summer, the sun poured through the cloisters and warmed the gardens, and the days lengthened into generous time. Yet the rhythm remained constant, regardless of the weather: prayer, work, silence, sleep. It was this constancy that gave the monastic life its quiet strength. While kings were dethroned and borders redrawn, the bell rang, and the monks came. There was also laughter, though it was rare. Not in the loud, boisterous way of taverns, but in shared glances, in the momentary twinkle in a brother's eye, in the warmth of knowing they were all bound together in the same sacred rhythm. Novices, young men barely past boyhood, sometimes struggled with the silence, the repetition, the isolation. But over time, most came to see it not as restriction, but as invitation. An invitation to listen more closely, to feel more deeply, to see more clearly. Even within this world of men, women found a parallel strength. Convents offered women space to learn, to lead, to shape their world. While society often silenced them, within the cloister, some rose as abbesses managing estates, leading liturgies, and preserving culture. The great Hildegard of Bingen composed music, wrote medical texts, and corresponded with popes and emperors, all from within her convent walls. She was not the exception. She was the proof that within these sacred enclosures, voices both male and female could echo beyond the walls. Yet not all was perfect. Some monasteries lost their way. Wealth brought temptation, and not every brother resisted. There were rumors of abbots who feasted too lavishly, of relics falsely claimed, of lands seized in the name of charity but held for gain. Reforms came and went, some successful, others buried under politics. But even amid this, the heart of monastic life pulsed on. For every scandal, there were dozens of brothers who rose in the cold to pray for a world that didn't know their names. One such night, as a soft snow blanketed the chapel roof, a lone monk lingered after Compline. He sat in the back pew, hands clasped, eyes closed. His thoughts wandered not in distraction, but in wonder. He remembered his life before this place. The noise, the longing, the ache of always chasing more. And now, in the silence, he found enough. Not perfection, but peace. A kind of peace that comes not from absence, but from presence, from doing small things with great care, from listening more than speaking, from waking each day to begin again. And so when the bell rang once more in the pale dark of morning, he rose without a word. He did not rush. He did not resist. He walked the stone corridor, feeling the cold seep into his feet, and stepped into the chapel. The chant began again, ancient, familiar, sacred. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and inside, the monastery breathed, while the monastery stood. As a place of timeless rhythm, there was another world that lived just outside its gates, one where time moved differently, less measured and far more unpredictable. The medieval village, humble and often forgotten in the grand tales of kings and wars, was in fact the beating heart of daily life for the vast majority of people. Its thatched rooftops clustered together like sleeping cattle around a central, green or a muddy well, and its people, worn by labor and weather alike, carried on in an endless cycle that was at once exhausting and reassuring. To live in a village was not to chase ambition, but to endure and to belong. Each villager had their role, etched as surely as grooves in a wooden plow. The blacksmith rose early, hammering iron into shape before the sun had cleared the treetops. The miller listened to the groan of the water wheel as he ground grain into flour. The thatcher repaired the roofs that curled from dampness and wind. And the women, those quiet anchors, spun wool, baked bread, tended gardens, raised children, and shaped the spirit of home with every whispered lullaby. The calendar of the village was not measured by months as we know them now, but by saints. Days, feasts, harvests, and weather. Time was not counted. It was remembered. After St. Cuthbert's Day, they might say, when the rain came late and the geese flew low. These seasonal markers gave a rhythm to life that was intimate and shared. Spring was the time of hope buds on branches, lambs stumbling. In fields, plows carving furrows into softened earth. Summer meant labor, days so long the light stretched far beyond supper, when hands worked until they burned and backs ached with quiet pride. Autumn was the moment of gathering, when wheat was threshed, apples pressed into cider, and firewood stacked in neat piles. Winter, the great quiet, was a test of preparation. If the harvest had been good and the stores were dry, families could rest with warmth. If not, they waited with worry. And always, through each season, the church offered both guidance and spectacle. The church was not merely a building of stone and timber. It was the village's compass, clock, and courtroom. It told the hours, marked the seasons, witnessed births, and mourned the dead. Inside, beneath vaulted beams and flickering candles, villagers gathered not only to pray, but to connect. Here, the Latin liturgy was spoken by the priest, largely unintelligible to the people, and yet the ritual itself kneeling, crossing. The scent of incense spoke in a language older than words. The stained glass caught the light and fractured it into rainbows that danced on the stone floor, a kind of accidental magic that children never tired of chasing. At Easter, the church bloomed with white linen and lily, while at Christmas, evergreen boughs adorned the altar and candles multiplied, making the darkness outside seem somehow gentler. And in between, saints' days provided occasions for modest celebration. Music played on rough-hewn fiddles, dancing that kicked up straw, shared meat from a rare slaughtered pig. These were not distractions, they were lifelines, tiny reprieves. In a life of constant demand, though hard, village life was not joyless. Laughter came easily, especially among the young and the old. Children played with hoops and sticks, skipped stones, and climbed trees with scraped knees and wind-burnt cheeks. Their games often echoed adult life, pretending to herd sheep, chase off wolves, or stir imaginary stews. The elderly, though worn, held treasured roles as keepers of memory. Around the hearth, their stories wove together past winters and lost. Loved ones, lessons learned, and warnings issued with a twinkle of humor. They did not speak of history as we do with dates and names. They spoke of moments, of seasons, of events stitched together with emotion rather than chronology. A cow that calved on the day the mill burned. A wedding the same week the frost came early. In this oral tapestry, the village held itself together. There was fear, too. Disease, fire, storms, and raids loomed always at the edges. A single cough might spread through households like a cruel wind. Lightning could turn a thatched roof to ash in minutes. And every so often, riders might appear on the horizon, tax collectors, soldiers, or strangers whose presence set every heart to uneasy pounding. Most villagers had never traveled more than a few miles from home. The world beyond was both mystery and menace, shaped more by rumor than reality. News came slowly, if at all, and was often filtered through the priest or the passing merchant. A battle fought hundreds of leagues away might be known only as the one where so-and-so's cousin died. And yet, even amid this fear, life went on. Babies were born, animals tended, marriages made, and fields tilled. The resilience was not heroic, but quiet, steady, woven into the very fabric of their days. Marriage was less about romance and more about survival and alliance. Young people often knew whom they would marry from childhood, their families having arranged it over shared bread and ale. The wedding itself was both sacred and social, a ceremony followed by feasting, dancing, and laughter. Dowries were modest: some chickens, a patch of land, a well-used blanket. And yet, within these unions, love sometimes bloomed, not the dramatic love of poetry, but a steady partnership built from shared labor and the raising of children. When a child was born, the entire village took part, for each new mouth to feed was also another pair of hands to help. Work in the village was endless but seasonal. Shepherds moved with their flocks across high pastures, their lives dictated by grass and weather. Farmers watched the sky with worry, hoping for just enough rain, but not too much. Weavers sat at looms, turning wool into fabric with aching fingers. And potters shaped earth into vessels that would carry water or store grain. Each trade was both a craft and a necessity. Skills passed from parent to child, not with textbooks, but with example and correction. A single broken wheel could delay a harvest. A misjudged fence might cost a cow. Everything mattered, because nothing was easily replaced. In the evenings, the village slowed. Smoke curled from chimneys, and light flickered through wooden shutters. Families gathered around fires, sharing meals of porridge, root vegetables, and the occasional dried meat. The sound of a spinning wheel, the crackle of flame, the sleepy murmur of a child being rocked to sleep, all mingled into a kind of lullaby. The night brought rest, but not always peace. Dreams were sometimes troubled, shaped by fatigue, hunger, or old fears. Wolves howled in the distance. The wind creaked through shutters. And yet, sleep came, as it always did, like a gentle thief. Among the villagers, there were always a few who did not quite fit the mold. The village idiot, who was sometimes wiser than he appeared. The old woman with herbs who some whispered was a witch, but whom everyone visited when a child's fever rose. The wandering bard who came once a year with songs and riddles. The tinker with a crooked smile and a sack full of things that no one asked too many questions about. They were part of the village too, not quite trusted, not quite rejected, like shadows that moved beside the firelight. Their presence reminded everyone that life was not only about plowing straight lines or baking the same bread. It had corners and curves, surprises and secrets, and over it all, the sky turned. Seasons shifted. Children grew. Elders passed. Names faded from memory. But the rhythm endured. It was not written down, not kept in parchment or scroll. It was kept in hands, in habit, in heart. And when one villager died, another rose at dawn, stepped out into the morning mist, and began again, without question, without glory. Simply because that is what life required. As the village settled each evening into silence and sleep, the road beyond it stretched onward, winding through hills, forests, and across stony ridges. For some, that road was merely a path to the next market or a trail to be avoided after dark. But for others, it was the only life they knew. In the world beyond the monastery and village, there existed a different class of medieval travelers, the pilgrims. These were not merchants or warriors, not nobles with banners or vagabonds with torn cloaks, but seekers. Pilgrims carried questions in their hearts and blisters on their feet, driven not by conquest or coin, but by faith, by fear, or by the thin thread of hope that redemption might be found at journey's end. To be a pilgrim was to be in motion, often for weeks or months, sometimes years. People from all walks of life took up the staff and satchel. A widow mourning a lost child might vow to walk to Santiago. A merchant, saved from illness, might promise to visit Canterbury. A knight, racked with guilt from war, might trudge barefoot to Rome. Even those with no clear sins sought peace. Pilgrimage was not just about penance, it was about letting go, about stepping outside the known world and allowing each footfall to become a prayer. Along the way, the world changed, and so did the pilgrim. Roads in the medieval world were unpredictable. Some followed ancient Roman routes, their stones still visible beneath moss and mud. Others were little more than goat trails, twisting between valleys or cutting across high plains swept by wind. Travelers shared these roads with farmers moving livestock, beggars seeking alms, and peddlers hawking trinkets. Danger came not just from wolves or robbers, but from the elements themselves. Sudden storms turned paths into rivers. Heat could sap the strongest legs. Hunger was a companion more persistent than any fellow traveler, and thirst could silence the most determined will. Yet pilgrims walked on, leaning into wind, stepping carefully over roots, sharing food with strangers, and stories with whoever would listen. Each mile walked was a mile away from who they had been, and a mile closer to who they might become. Way stations and hospices dotted the more famous pilgrimage routes. These shelters, often attached to monasteries, were humble but life-saving. Pilgrims were offered bread, cheese, perhaps a bit of broth. They slept on straw pallets, their feet soaking in cold basins of water. In exchange, they listened to the monks' gentle words, or the whisper of prayer in a quiet chapel. Some left a token, a coin, a ribbon, a small carving of a saint as both thanks and talisman. Others left nothing but a name, scribbled on. A list kept by the door, recorded with care by hands used to scripture. These places were oases in a journey where comforts were rare, and they reminded pilgrims that even the hardest path was lined with mercy, that not every pilgrim traveled alone. Some moved in groups, small ragged clusters that formed by chance and dissolved without ceremony. Companionship offered safety, of course, but also distraction. Stories were shared around fires, songs hummed as feet dragged, laughter sparked. Over shared misfortunes. There were arguments too, for not all pilgrims were noble in spirit. Some were arrogant. Some were thieves in disguise. Others had joined the pilgrimage under pressure, seeking to escape punishment or poverty rather than earn grace. But over time, the road wore away false pretenses. All arrived at the same aches, the same hunger, the same prayers muttered under breath while staring at endless stretches of horizon. Landscapes shifted as pilgrims moved from one region to another. A flat plain would give way to dense forest, where the canopy swallowed sunlight and roots tangled underfoot. Then came high mountain passes, where air thinned and stones slid under sandals. Sometimes a pilgrim might pause on a ridge and look back, astonished at how far they'd come. The village they left behind would now feel like a faded dream. And ahead, always ahead, was the shrine, the cathedral, the relic that promised comfort or transformation. In truth, few pilgrims knew what they would find. Some imagined miracles. Others simply hoped for peace. But the destination mattered less than the path. And the walking, with its slow erosion of ego, was its own quiet blessing. Each holy site offered something different. In Santiago de Compostela, pilgrims approached the great cathedral through the narrow streets of northern Spain, exhausted and sunburned, but uplifted by the sound of bells and the sight of the towering spires. In Rome, they climbed the worn steps of sacred basilicas, kissing stone and whispering names of those they had loved and lost. In Canterbury, the tomb of St. Thomas Becket drew throngs, all hoping to touch the site where blood had soaked into. Altar, relics, the bones, cloth, or objects linked to saints were displayed behind glass or under gilded domes. Some believed these relics healed the sick, restored vision, or soothed wounded hearts. Others were content to simply kneel, to light a candle, and to feel something inside them shift. However subtly, when the pilgrimage ended, the journey was not over. Pilgrims returned changed. Their legs stronger, their backs stooped, their minds quieter. Some brought back souvenirs, scallop shells from Compostela, badges, or painted tokens. Others returned with nothing tangible, only a story. In some villages, returning pilgrims were honored, asked to share their tale at feast days or in the village square. Children stared wide-eyed as they described deserts, mountains, or cathedrals with ceilings so high they seemed to hold the sky. Not all returns were joyful. Some pilgrims fell ill along the way or died on distant roads, their names left behind in monastery guestbooks or whispered in prayers by strangers. But even they, in their incomplete journeys, were remembered as having walked the sacred road. Women, too, made pilgrimages, though with more difficulty. Traveling alone was dangerous, and many disguised themselves as men or joined larger groups for protection. Noble women sometimes rode on palfreys, with servants and letters of safe conduct. Poorer women walked, bearing the same calluses and hope as their male counterparts. At shrines they prayed not only for forgiveness but for fertility, for protection during childbirth, or for strength to endure the daily injustices of life. Some became famous for their pilgrimages, women who crossed borders, braved storms, and left behind diaries or stories that would inspire others long after. Pilgrimage was also political. Kings used pilgrimages to show humility or secure alliances. Popes issued indulgences to pilgrims, promising spiritual rewards for their efforts. Cities along major routes flourished, building inns, churches, and marketplaces to welcome the steady stream of souls. Relics themselves became contested, moved, stolen, or duplicated by rival churches hoping to attract pilgrims and the wealth they brought. Amid this, the sincerity of the individual journey remained untouched. A cobbler from Bruges, a farmer from Gascony, or a shepherd from Wales might pass through the same gates as royalty, pray at the same altar, and weep with the same quiet longing. The road itself became sacred, marked by cairns, crosses, and the footprints of those who came before. It carried not only pilgrims but the memory of pilgrimage. Travelers walked not alone, but in a long procession of centuries. The dust held echoes. The trees had seen it all. And somewhere in the rhythm of walking, of repeating prayers with breath and step, something softened. Some found what they sought. Others did not, but all were changed. Even if they could not explain how that and so, the road continued just as it always had. Through villages and cities, over rivers and ridges, beneath sun and snow. A thread through time, worn smooth by hope. Even now, if you listen, you might hear footsteps in the distance. Someone, somewhere, still walking. Still searching. Beyond the roads walked by pilgrims, and the fields worked by peasants, lay the realm of castles and courts, a world that shimmered with mystery and menace alike. The medieval castle, rising from its hill or island like a stone. Sentinel was both fortress and home, symbol and stronghold. To most villagers, it was a distant shape on the horizon, a place of power both revered and feared. But to those within its walls, life unfolded according to a rhythm just as structured, just as human, though cloaked in layers of armor, etiquette, and whispered intrigue. Inside, beneath banners and beams, the lords and ladies of the realm lived. Lives shaped by duty and performance, each moment carefully balanced between tradition, reputation, and survival. The castle was not just a single tower, but a complex web of rooms, passageways, courtyards, and keeps. The outermost defenses, the walls and moats, spoke of a world ever ready for siege. But within, the great hall stood at the center, a cavernous room where meals were served, guests received, and justice proclaimed. Its long tables bore trenchers of bread, flagons of ale, and meat seasoned more with smoke than with spice. Above it all, the Lord's high table stood beneath a canopied dais, flanked by banners bearing coats of arms, a visual language of lineage and loyalty. Behind the splendor lay the routines of daily life. Servants bustled before dawn, hauling water, chopping wood, tending fires that never quite warmed the drafty stone. Cooks stirred porridge in cauldrons the size of bathtubs. Pages polished armor, ran errands, and learned the manners expected of future knights. For the lord and lady of the castle, each day was a dance of responsibilities. The lord, trained in warfare and diplomacy, held court with vassals, reviewed disputes among tenants, inspected his estate, and prepared for whatever political storm might roll in from beyond his lands. The lady, no less powerful in her own sphere, managed the domestic heart of the castle. She oversaw servants, organized feasts, arranged marriages, kept records, and provided care for the sick within the castle walls. Contrary to some tales, the lady was not idle, nor merely decorative. Her role required intelligence, endurance, and a sense of command. Children born in castles were raised with one eye on the future. Boys of noble birth began training early, first as pages, then squires, serving older knights, learning to ride, hunt, and handle weapons. They studied Latin, history, music, and heraldry, but more importantly, they absorbed the unspoken codes of chivalry, honor, loyalty, restraint. Girls, meanwhile, were trained in the management of households, in embroidery, singing, reading, and in the complex dance of diplomacy that came with marriage. For both, the castle was a school as much as a home, and the lessons were lifelong. Not all within the castle were noble. Servants formed the quiet spine of the fortress. Some were born into service, others came by choice, and a few arrived by misfortune. There were stable boys who slept near the horses they tended, cooks who carried burn scars and knew recipes by scent alone, laundresses who worked beside frozen rivers, and guards who paced walls in biting wind. Their lives were not chronicled, but they shaped the reality of every noble family. In the stillness of pre-dawn hours, their footsteps echoed through empty halls. They knew the castle in its unguarded moments, when candles flickered low and the only sound was the creak of beams, or the howl of a distant wolf. Food in the castle reflected both status and scarcity. On feast days, the great hall filled with smells of roasting meat, honey-glazed pies, and mulled wine. Musicians played as jesters tumbled, and platters were brought forth with exaggerated flair. Yet outside of celebrations, meals were simpler. Bread was coarse, meat often salted or smoked to preserve it, and vegetables boiled until soft. Spices were rare and treasured, brought from distant lands at great cost. Salt, too, was precious, used not only for flavor but for status. A guest's position at table above or below the salt spoke volumes about their rank. Entertainment in the castle took many forms. There were musicians who plucked harps or flutes, singers who recited ballads of heroes long gone, and storytellers whose tales wove dragons and saints into memory. On quieter nights, chessboards appeared, dice were rolled, and riddles passed from lip to lip beside the fire. Hunting, however, remained a noble pursuit of choice. Lords and ladies donned heavy cloaks and rode into the forest with falcons on gloved hands or spears at the ready. It was not merely sport, it was a statement of dominance over nature, a practice in coordination, and an excuse for pageantry. Despite the layers of stone and steel, life within the castle was not untouched by fear. Storms tested even the thickest walls. Illness spread quickly through tight quarters. The threat of siege was never far. During such times, villagers from the surrounding lands might be called within the outer walls, crowding together in anxious silence. Supplies were rationed, gates barred, and archers posted along the battlements. In those moments, the castle became less a symbol of power and more a sanctuary, a place where lives were held together by discipline and endurance. Yet not all threats came from outside. Intrigue lived within the castle walls like ivy through cracks. Ambitions whispered behind tapestries. Alliances formed and broke in the span of a conversation. A misplaced word could become a rumor. A rumor could become a weapon. Letters were sent in secret, meals tasted for poison, and trust became a currency more valuable than gold. The court was a stage, and everyone played a part. Even the quietest servant could become the bearer of secrets, simply by passing unnoticed through doorways, or overhearing what was meant to be private. Religion shaped castle life as surely as stone and sword. Chapels stood within the keep, where morning prayers began each day, and confessions were heard in candlelight. Monks and chaplains offered counsel, transcribed texts, and reminded even the most powerful that their souls were under judgment. Icons adorned walls. Psalms were sung at dawn and dusk. On holy days, the castle fell still as Mass was held. Faith was not merely decoration, it was duty, it was structure, and at times, it was comfort. Seasonal rhythms dictated the castle's pace. In spring, repairs were made, gardens planted, and supplies replenished. Summer brought campaigns or visits to nearby estates. Autumn meant harvest, feasting, and preparation for winter. And winter itself cold, gray, heavy was a time of introspection. Fires were lit in every hearth. Woolen cloaks were layered over linen. Life slowed, conversations deepened, and the echo of hooves across a frozen courtyard felt louder than thunder. Snow turned the castle to a sculpture, and the world outside faded behind misted glass. Still, not all castles were grand. Some were. Modest stone towers, cold and damp, more prison than palace. Others crumbled into ruin, their owners fallen from grace, their halls home to birds and moss. The image of the majestic castle tall, proud, invincible, was not always the truth. But even in their decay, these structures spoke. Their worn steps told of generations past. Their walls held echoes of laughter, argument, vows, betrayal, and hope. Each one a chapter in a book written not with ink, but with time. And so, within the stone walls of the castle, life carried on. Not just battles and banners, but sewing and sweeping, music and mealtime, loneliness and longing. The lords who ruled, the servants who served, the children who learned, and the strangers who passed through all played their part. Outside, the wind howled across towers. Inside, a candle flickered beside a bed where someone dreamed of glory or simply of tomorrow. Far beyond the castle walls, away from the damp earth of villages and the solemn stone of monasteries, rose another world, one less tied to soil and sword, and more devoted to thought, ink, and quiet illumination. It was the world of the medieval scholar. For most, learning in the Middle Ages was a mystery wrapped in Latin, cloistered in shadowed halls, and reserved for the few. Yet within that silence, minds stirred, candles burned late into the night, and knowledge, however fragile, was kept alive. To step into this realm was to enter a place where words held power, and silence, sometimes, meant reverence. The medieval university, though primitive by modern standards, was a marvel of its time. Clusters of students gathered around masters beneath arches or in drafty halls, their breath fogging the air in winter, their fingers stained with ink from parchment. Universities in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford began as associations of scholars groups who came together not for wealth or fame, but for inquiry. The subjects studied were few but deep. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic formed the trivium, while arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy composed the quadrivium. These disciplines, inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, laid the foundation for all other knowledge. Like the scaffolding of a cathedral yet to be completed, classes were not as we know them now. A master would read aloud from a sacred text, Aristotle, perhaps, or the writings of the Church Fathers, and students would listen, annotate, and then argue. Debate was central to learning. Through dialectic, truth might be glimpsed. And yet, even disagreement was bound by decorum. One did not shout in anger, but questioned with care. Logic was the sword, humility the shield. A student who excelled might one day teach. A master might one day write. But none of it was hurried. To earn a degree might take 10 years or more. The pursuit of wisdom, like the copying of a manuscript, was slow by design. Books themselves were rare and precious. Each one copied by hand, letter by careful letter, onto parchment scraped smooth from calfskin. A single mistake could mean hours of correction. In monasteries, scribes worked in scriptoria long, narrow rooms where sunlight streamed through narrow windows and silence ruled. Pens made from reeds or feathers dipped into ink of oak gall and iron. Illuminators added color later blue made. From lapis lazuli, red from cinnabar, gold from leaf so thin it trembled with breath. These books were more than information. They were sacred vessels, each one a monument to patience. Outside the universities, other centers of learning persisted. The great libraries of Islamic cities preserved and translated texts lost to the West, feeding knowledge back into Europe through Spain and Sicily. Jewish scholars studied Talmud and Torah, often writing in the margins of texts with insights that bridged centuries. Christian monks copied scripture, but also kept medical texts, histories, and scientific observations, their work forming quiet bridges between generations. Learning in the Middle Ages was not confined to one language or land. It was a vast, slow-moving river, fed by many springs. Women, though rarely admitted into formal universities, found paths to learning through other means. Some entered convents where nuns taught reading, music, and healing. Others became patrons, funding scholars or collecting books in private libraries. A few wrote under pseudonyms or translated works under the protection of powerful families. They did not always wear robes or hold titles, but their influence pulsed beneath the surface like roots beneath winter soil. In their letters, poems, and prayers, fragments of their minds endure. Language shaped thought, and Latin was the key to scholarly life. Students spoke it, wrote it, and even joked in it. To know Latin was to enter a brotherhood that stretched across borders. A scholar from England could debate one from Italy without needing translation. This linguistic unity gave the medieval world a sense of cohesion, a shared intellectual tongue in a time when political fragmentation was the norm. But it also created barriers. The poor, the illiterate, the local, those without Latin were shut out. Knowledge, for all its beauty, had its gatekeepers. Astronomy was studied not just for curiosity but for order. The stars marked time, guided planting, and suggested divine harmony. Scholars mapped the heavens with armillary spheres, aligning planets with philosophy. Music, too, was seen as mathematical intervals and ratios reflecting celestial order. Medicine drew upon Galen and Hippocrates, blending ancient theory with herbal remedies. Bloodletting, humors, and astrology all played their parts. While much of it seems primitive now, at the time it was sincere, careful, and deeply interconnected. To understand the body was to understand balance, not only within organs, but within nature and soul. Among the most revered pursuits was theology, the study of God and the soul. Here, questions were not taken lightly. What was the nature of sin? Could one know God through reason alone? What did it mean to be saved? These were not abstract musings. They touched every life, from the highest bishop to the humblest peasant. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas labored to reconcile faith with logic, drawing from Aristotle and Scripture alike. His Summa Theologica, vast and orderly, was an attempt to map the ineffable. He wrote not to boast, but to serve to make clear the mysteries of heaven in the language of earth. Yet, even in this noble pursuit, conflict brewed. Heresy loomed like a shadow. Ideas once voiced could be deemed dangerous. Some books were banned, some scholars condemned. The Inquisition rose not from malice alone, but from fear that knowledge untethered might unravel society. And so, the scholar walked a narrow path, balancing inquiry with obedience. Too much of either could lead to ruin. The physical spaces of scholarship reflected its contradictions. Cloisters wrapped around quiet gardens, where monks walked in meditative circles murmuring prayers. Lecture halls were cold and bare, warmed only by the friction of thought. Libraries smelled of dust, wax, and old leather. There were no desks filled with noise or light. Instead, one candle, one page, one mind alone with the centuries. Still, despite these limitations, the seed of something vast was being planted. Every argument refined, every text preserved, every idea written down, each was a link in a long chain. Without them, there would be no Renaissance, no Enlightenment, no modern world. These medieval scholars, half forgotten and cloaked in robes and candlelight, were building cathedrals not of stone, but of thought. And so, within quiet chambers and wind-worn towers, beneath vaults of stone or thatched roofs, the pursuit of knowledge carried on, not for applause or reward, but for understanding. In a world lit only by flame and faith, each word written, each truth pursued, became a spark. And those sparks, patient and persistent, kept the dark at bay. While scholars and scribes preserved knowledge within their towers and cloisters, far beyond those walls, another force quietly shaped the medieval worldcraft. In busy towns and along narrow streets, artisans bent over their benches, chiseling, forging, spinning, and shaping. These were the blacksmiths, the weavers, the masons, the tanners, the hands of a society that stood on labor as surely as it did on belief. In the flicker of firelight and the rhythm of hammers, The medieval artisan built not only tools and wares, but the very fabric of daily life. Their work, often overlooked in grand histories, was constant and essential, humming like a heartbeat. Beneath the centuries, each town or city had its own web of workshops, nestled between homes, inns, and churches. These were not factories, but spaces of craft small, dense, and filled with the scent of materials. A shoemaker's stall smelled of leather and glue. A baker's window steamed with the breath of rising dough. A blacksmith's forge crackled with heat and iron. These were not simply places of commerce. They were extensions of the artisan's body and mind, where skill passed not through books, but through calloused fingers and watching eyes. The apprentice system structured this world. A child of 10 or 12 might be sent to live with a master learning the trade, not through lectures, but through repetition. Sweeping the floor, pumping the bellows, fetching tools. Watching closely, mimicking each motion. Years would pass before the apprentice earned the right to call themselves a journeyman, traveling from town to town, refining their skills under different roofs. Only after yet more years, and with the presentation of a masterpiece, might one join a guild and open a shop of their own. It was a slow path, one measured not by ambition, but by patience and practice. Guilds were the invisible scaffolding behind every trade. These associations regulated quality, settled disputes, and protected the interests of their members. A poorly made sword, a sour loaf, a cracked jug, these could all result in fines or public shame. Guilds ensured that craftsmanship remained a matter of pride, not just profit. They also provided social support. When a member fell ill, the guild helped. When one died, the guild saw to the burial. In many towns, they even funded festivals, chapels, and public works. To belong to a guild was to have a place in the civic body, a role both respected and regulated. Among the most admired trades was masonry. Stone was eternal, and those who shaped it held a kind of reverence. Cathedral builders, in particular, were viewed with awe. They worked not from blueprints, but from experience, lore, and the geometry of rope and chalk. Each arch had to bear weight. Each vault had to lift the eye upward. These structures, some of which still stand, were miracles of physics and faith. A mason might spend his entire life working on a single building, never living to see the spire completed. Yet he carved each stone with care, knowing that his part, however small, contributed to something vast. In contrast, the tanner worked in smells rather than light. Their trade, essential to leatherworking, was considered so foul that tanneries were often placed outside town walls. Hides were soaked in urine or lime, scraped of hair, then steeped in vats of fermented bark. The stench was legendary. Yet without this labor, there would be no belts, shoes, bindings, or saddles. The tanner, though avoided in markets, held an indispensable place in the chain of medieval life. He toiled amid filth but produced material that dressed nobles and peasants alike. Blacksmiths were perhaps the most iconic artisans of all. Their forges lit the nights with glowing coal. Their hammers sang against anvils like church bells. They made horseshoes and hinges, swords and scythes, nails and locks. Each item required heat, timing, and strength. A single mistake could ruin hours of work. Yet the smith worked steadily, often with an apprentice at his side, a rhythm between fire and steel that echoed the pulse of the town itself. In times of war, the smith armed knights. In times of peace, he mended tools. Always there, always. Shaping. Women, too, played vital roles in craft. Though excluded from many guilds, they worked in spinning, brewing, midwifery, and textile production. Some took over their husbands' shops after death. Others ran informal networks, selling goods from homes or stalls. Embroidery, in particular, became a form of expression and artistry. In convents and noble halls, women created altar cloths, tapestries, and garments stitched with scenes of saints, battles, and gardens. These threads told stories just as vividly as any chronicle, woven not with ink but with color and patience. Markets were the stage where all this labor met the public. Weekly or seasonal fairs transformed town squares into rivers of trade. Stalls lined the cobblestone. Voices called out wares, coins clinked into purses. A cobbler displayed boots alongside a potter's glazed jugs. A spice merchant from the east set up beside a weaver's rough wool. These gatherings were not only economic, they were social. Gossip, matchmaking, music, and chance encounters mingled with barter and sale. The artisan, usually cloistered in their shop, emerged into daylight to meet customers, competitors, and travelers alike. Not all artisans lived in towns. In villages, craftspeople served multiple roles. A carpenter might also thatch roofs. A smith might double as farrier. Without the structure of guilds, their work was more flexible, but also more precarious. Barter was common. A plow repaired in exchange for food. A garment sewn for firewood. In these places, craft and survival were intertwined. The artisan was part of the community's rhythm, called upon in birth, in harvest, in repair, and in death. Tools were the silent companions of every artisan. Simple, sturdy, and often handmade, they carried the memory of work. A chisel worn smooth by use. A needle passed down through generations. A plane with initials carved into the handle. These tools were more than implements. They were extensions of the self, repositories of skill, and quiet witnesses to years of effort. They did not speak, but they told stories in every mark and groove. And yet, craft in the Middle Ages was not romantic. It was hard. Days began before dawn and ended long after sunset. Injuries were common. Profits were thin. Competition was fierce. Tools broke. Customers complained. Illness swept through towns. Fires destroyed shops. Floods ruined supplies. And still, the artisan rose each morning, lit the fire, picked up the tool, and began again. Because craft was not just a job, it was identity. At night, after the market closed and the shutters were drawn, the town grew quiet. But if you walked the alleys slowly, you might still hear it, a faint tapping from a window, a whetstone scraping metal, the soft whir of a spinning wheel. These sounds were lullabies of labor, reminders that even as others slept, hands still worked, minds still shaped, and the great quiet engine of the medieval world continued to turn. The legacy of these artisans endures, not in grand paintings or golden tombs, but in the curve of a carved door, the smoothness of a worn step, the strength of a centuries-old wall. Their names are mostly lost, their faces forgotten, but their hands remain visible in every corner of the old world. In every detail, others pass without notice. They built not just objects, but time itself, layer upon layer, stroke by careful stroke. And so beneath the high towers and beside the flowing rivers, between prayers and battles, the artisan shaped history quietly, steadily, and with the dignity of those who craft not for glory, but for purpose. Their world was not one of spectacle, but of substance. A world forged in fire, sewn in thread, carved in stone, and turned with the same rhythm as the seasons. And though their stories are soft, like whispers between pages, they are everywhere waiting, always to be noticed. As the bells tolled across the distant hills and smoke rose gently from village hearths, there existed yet another realm of medieval life, one neither noble nor peasant, neither soldier nor scholar. This was the life of the traveler, the pilgrim, the merchant, and the vagabond. The roads of the Middle Ages were threads across a vast and varied tapestry, connecting forests to towns, abbeys to cities, coastlines to highland passes. They were seldom smooth, often treacherous, and always uncertain. Yet along them walked countless feet, moved by faith, by need, by trade, or by something harder to name, a quiet restlessness, a search for meaning, or perhaps just the pull of the unknown. Travel in the medieval world was a deliberate act. There were no carriages for most, no maps as we know them, and no guarantee of safety. Paths could turn to mud, bridges collapse, robbers lie in wait. A journey of 20 miles might take 2 days, with nightfall bringing not comfort, but caution. And yet, despite this, people traveled. A monk from Canterbury set out for Rome. A spice trader left Constantinople for Cologne. A widow joined a caravan to Santiago de Compostela. Pilgrimage, commerce, war, exile, curiosity all sent people onto the winding roads that threaded through Europe like ancient veins. Pilgrims were perhaps the most common travelers, and their journeys were deeply symbolic. With wide-brimmed hats, worn cloaks, and wooden staffs, they sought sacred destinations, the tomb of a saint, the relic of a martyr, the cathedral built atop a vision. Each mile walked was a prayer, each blister an offering. Pilgrims carried letters of passage and badges of their destination, scallop shells for Compostela, keys for Rome, a cross for Jerusalem. They stayed in hospices and monasteries along the way, sharing bread and stories by firelight with strangers who, like them, walked with hope in their hearts and the ache of the road in their bones. Merchants followed different routes but traveled just as far. Some moved between local towns, selling cloth, salt, or pottery. Others crossed mountains and seas, bringing silk from the east or amber from the north. The merchant's journey was one of calculation whether, profit, danger, and demand. Yet it was also a journey of encounter. In bustling fairs and crowded ports, merchants met people of different languages, customs, and gods. Deals were struck, alliances formed, misunderstandings negotiated with gestures and coins. The medieval market was not just a place of goods, but of culture. Along these roads, ideas moved too in the fold of fabric, the twist of a spice, the echo of a song. Not all travelers walked with purpose. Some wandered because they had no choice. Displaced by war, famine, or punishment, they drifted from town to town, carrying their possessions in sacks or carts, often met with suspicion. Laws in some places required vagrants to leave by sunset. Others might offer alms, a meal, a barn in which to sleep. These travelers were ghosts of the road, their presence fleeting, their stories barely recorded. Yet they too were part of the great movement of medieval life, a reminder that for many, stability was a dream and motion a necessity. Hospitals and inns dotted the roads, often run by religious orders or civic guilds. A traveler might find shelter, a bowl of soup, and a blanket under a roof that leaked but still offered more than open sky. Monks tended to the sick, washed blistered feet, and offered mass at dawn. In towns, inns provided more comfort, though prices varied and beds were often shared. Privacy was rare. Lice and fleas common. But in the company of others, fears lessened, songs rose, and tales unfolded like maps drawn in memory. Every traveler had a story. Some exaggerated, some true. All part of the human need to make sense of distance. One could not speak of travel without speaking of roads themselves. Roman roads still form the backbone of many routes, their stones worn but enduring. Newer roads were little more than rutted tracks, winding through fields, forests, and hills. In winter, they turned to muck. In spring, to trickling streams. Bridges, when they existed, were often wooden and frail. Ferries served river crossings. Bandits took advantage of narrow passes and dense woods. To travel was to risk, but it was also to witness. A dawn over moorland, a hawk circling above a field, a village waking in mist. These were sights few villagers ever saw, moments that stitched the traveler to the world in quiet awe. Messages traveled too, though slowly. Royal couriers carried letters across kingdoms, often guarded and sealed with wax. Merchants carried news from town to town. Minstrels sang songs of events far away. In a world without printing presses or telegraphs, travel was the bloodstream through which information flowed. A traveler might arrive with rumors of plague or news of a birth, or tales of a new tax. In marketplaces, word spread faster than any scroll. Truth mingled with fiction, but always left a mark. Horses and carts were precious. Few owned them. Most walked. A sturdy mule was a treasure, a cart a sign of relative wealth. Horses needed food, shoes, and care, and were vulnerable to theft. Many travelers preferred to carry their burdens rather than risk them stolen. Foot travel was slower, but surer. One could duck into woods, avoid tolls, and sleep where one stopped. Boots were mended with twine, feet wrapped in wool. A good walking stick was as valuable as a knife. Language was a barrier, yet also a bridge. Latin served in churches and among the educated, but on the road, one relied on gestures, on shared songs, on the universal needs of food, shelter, and warmth. Travelers developed a kind of intuition reading. Faces, sensing danger, finding kindness in the flicker of an eye. In taverns, words flowed in multiple dialects, mingled with laughter, ale, and the occasional brawl. Travel stripped people of their familiar identity. On the road, a noble could seem a beggar. A woman might dress as a man. A monk might forget his vows. The road allowed transformation. Religious processions also took to the roads, bands of flagellants during times of plague, groups of monks bearing relics to new shrines, or missionaries seeking to convert distant villages. These processions were half sacred ritual, half performance. Drums beat, banners waved. Hymns rose into the dust of the road. For those who watched from fields and doorways, such spectacles were both fearful and awe-inspiring. A reminder of the world beyond their daily toil. Weather was the constant companion, both friend and foe. A sunny day could ease the journey, lift the spirit. A sudden storm could ruin plans, flood paths, and turn hope to hardship. Travelers learned to read the sky, the wind, the feel of the air. A red dawn, a sudden silence among birds. The scent of rain in the breeze. The world itself whispered clues, and those who walked it listened well. Tolls and taxes dotted the route. Lords demanded payment for crossing their lands. Bridges came with fees. Ports required permits. Sometimes it was formal, stamped and sealed. Other times, a man with a sword stood in the path and demanded coin. Travel cost more than time. It required constant negotiation, barter, and cunning. Yet the determined always found ways forward. Artisans traveled too. Wandering masons sought work on distant cathedrals. Musicians followed festivals. Actors carried their stages in carts. These traveling folk brought life to far-flung corners, carried stories from one valley to another. They were bridges between the settled and the strange. Children gathered to hear their songs. Elders remembered the last time such faces passed through. In a world defined by repetition, travelers brought change. And so, the road stretched on, sometimes muddy, sometimes sunlit, always uncertain. It tested the body, shaped the soul, and offered no promises. Yet for those who walked it, there was something quietly sacred in the rhythm of feet, the scent of a new town, the flicker of distant lanterns in the dusk. To travel in the Middle Ages was to surrender to the moment, to accept discomfort, and to find in each step a kind of prayer. In the folds of the medieval landscape, where hills rolled softly and forests whispered secrets to the wind, life was carried forward not only by lords or monks, but by the most ordinary of rhythms, birth and death, planting and harvest, love and illness. These moments, seemingly mundane, were the fabric of existence. They unfolded in cottages warmed by hearths, in fields tilled by hand, in songs passed from mother to daughter, and in prayers whispered beneath stars. Though kings ruled from there, thrones and popes from their altars, it was in the daily life of the common folk that history truly breathed. Here, in the routine, in the repetition, in the quiet labor, one finds the pulse of the Middle Ages. To be born in the medieval world was to arrive into uncertainty. Most births occurred at home, with midwives guiding the process using knowledge passed down through generations. Herbs were prepared, warm cloths readied, prayers whispered. Birth was sacred and dangerous, a threshold moment where two lives stood at risk. Infant mortality was high. Mothers, too, faced peril. But when both emerged safely, the cottage filled with joy-soft weeping, quiet laughter, and the hurried sprinkling of holy water, for baptism could not wait. To name a child was to welcome them into both family and faith, to place them within the circle of hope. Childhood was brief. By the age of 7, a child was expected to contribute. In noble houses, this meant beginning formal education or entering service as a page. In peasant homes, it meant fetching water, tending animals, or learning the rhythms of sowing and harvest. Play existed, of course, wooden toys, simple games, laughter around the fire, but always beneath the shadow of responsibility. Life was not measured in years but in seasons. A child might be married by 12, apprenticed by 10, or orphaned even earlier. Yet despite the harshness, joy was found in small things. The taste of honey, the sound of a flute, the dance of fireflies on a summer night. Marriage was rarely about love alone. It was an agreement, a contract, a necessity. Among the nobility, marriages were strategic alliances between families, transfers of land and power. Daughters were pawns, sons were heirs, and love, if it came, was a luxury. Among common folk, choice was more flexible, but still constrained by duty and survival. A strong partner meant shared labor. A good dowry could ensure a roof. Weddings were often simple, a blessing at the church door, a feast of bread and ale, a song rising into the dark. Love, when it appeared, was private and precious, growing in glances, in shared burdens, in whispered jokes between chores. Homes were humble. A peasant's cottage held 1 or 2 rooms, shared by humans and animals alike. The floor was dirt. The air smelled of smoke and straw. Windows were few, furniture sparse. The hearth was the center source of warmth, food, and comfort. Meals were simple: pottage, bread, perhaps some cheese. Meat was rare, ale more common than water. Clothing was homespun, patched again and again. Shoes, if owned, were prized. Yet within these walls, stories were told, lullabies sung, and children raised with care. A home did not need wealth to feel full. It needed presence, persistence, and the comfort of routine. Illness was constant. Fevers, infections, injuries, each could end a life. The Black Death loomed like a shadow, but even ordinary ailments could devastate. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools, no reliable hospitals. Healing was a mix of prayer, herbs, superstition, and care. Wise women knew which roots to boil. Monks kept medicinal gardens. Amulets were worn, charms whispered. Sometimes the body healed, sometimes it did not. Death was not hidden away, but lived with. It came into homes, sat at bedsides, and left silence in its wake. Yet even then, rituals brought comfort: candles lit, bells rung, prayers said to guide the soul. Beyond religion anchored every moment. The church bell marked the hours. Saints watched from stained glass. Holy days shaped the calendar. People prayed in the morning, at meals, before sleep. They made pilgrimages, kissed relics, fasted and feasted. Faith was not questioned. It was woven into breath itself. When crops failed, it was penance. When children were born, it was grace. A priest heard confessions. A nun offered kindness. God was both judge and comforter, near and far. The church, though sometimes corrupt, offered more than doctrine. It offered rhythm, purpose, and community. Entertainment was humble but heartfelt. Music filled spaces where words fell short. A lute played by the fire. A drum in the village square. Dancing in circles, voices raised in harmony. Festivals brought laughter, games, feasts, jesters, mimes. Stories were told, riddles asked, fortunes guessed. Even in hardship, people sought delight. A painted jug, a well-woven tunic, a clever rhyme, these small pleasures stitched joy into hard days. Life was not just endured, it was savored even. If only in brief, flickering moments, seasons governed all. Spring brought plowing and lambing, summer, growth and haymaking. Autumn, harvest and preparation, winter, cold and waiting. Each task, each motion, tied to the earth's turning. Tools were sharpened, seeds scattered, wool spun, bread baked. The land was not just where one lived, it was how one lived. Its moods were understood, its rhythms respected. A good harvest meant survival, a bad one meant hunger. Yet through droughts and floods, people endured, adapting, hoping, praying. They knew the soil as they knew each other, flawed, fickle, and deeply necessary. Justice was local. A village might have a reeve or a bailiff appointed to settle disputes. Fines were paid in chickens, labor, or coin. Public shaming was common, a man in the stocks, a woman paraded with shaved head. Lords held courts, judged tenants, punished. Thieves, the church too, had power, excommunication, penance, sanctuary. Law was not consistent but was enforced. Fairness depended on status, favor, and luck. Yet most people tried to avoid courts, solving disputes with elders, with oaths, or with grudging silence. Travel was rare. Most lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. News came slowly through merchants, pilgrims, returning soldiers. Foreign lands were dreams, imagined in tales, or seen in the faces of strangers. The world was both vast and tiny. A neighboring village could feel distant, a nearby forest unknowable. Yet in this closeness, bonds formed. People knew their neighbors, their animals, their weather. A shared look at market. A wave across a field. Community was not a word but a fact. Old age, when reached, was respected. Elders told stories, remembered lineages, offered advice. They sat near fires, rocked babies, sharpened tools with shaking hands. Their lives were maps, scars, smiles, regrets. They had seen harvests fail, kings fall, loved ones buried. There, words were listened to, not always heeded. They held memory, and when they died, they left behind not wealth, but wisdom, tucked into sayings, habits, and family tales. Women bore much. They worked, birthed, fed, nursed, mended, managed. Their work was invisible but essential. They lit the fires needed. The dough combed the hair of the dying. Their knowledge passed mouth to ear. Their strength, often unrecognized, held households together. Girls learned by doing, by watching, by enduring. Some became midwives, some healers, some leaders within their communities. Their names rarely entered chronicles, but their touch shaped everyday dot, and so life unfolded, not in grand events, but in repetition. The lighting of lamps, the mending of fences, the saying of grace. It was not glamorous, it was not simple, but it was full of love, grief, routine, surprise, of children's laughter, of aching backs, of stolen kisses, of quiet prayers. History often overlooks these lives. Yet they were the foundation. The countless unnamed whose days, stacked like bricks, built centuries. To imagine the medieval world is often to picture castles and crowns. But the true story lies elsewhere, in the worn shoes by the door, the lines on a mother's hands, the warmth of bread shared among many. This was a world of texture, rhythm, and deep human presence. A world where life was fragile, but fiercely held. Where each day, though difficult, was greeted and lived, not with grandeur, but with grace. And so, as we near the end of our long and quiet journey through the medieval world, a hush seems to fall over the hills and hearths we've visited. The torches fade in the manor halls, the market stalls are shuttered for the night, and even the Restless roads fall silent beneath the moon's slow rise. There is a stillness here, not of absence, but of memory. A silence not empty, but full of lives once lived in rhythm with seasons, in harmony with craft, with faith, with land, and above all, with time. For the Middle Ages were not a single moment of grandeur or darkness, but a mosaic of moments, tender, bitter, strange, and familiar. And beneath the surface of battles and crowns, the true story always waited. Soft as breath, this story, at its heart, is one of people. Not merely the names engraved in chronicles, but the unrecorded millions who shaped the world by living it. Their voices do not echo loudly through stone halls, but they linger in the curve of a worn staircase, in the stitching of a faded tapestry, in the still-standing timber of a cottage long forgotten by maps. These were the farmers rising before dawn to scatter seed, the millers bent over stone wheels, the children tracing letters with crooked fingers on slate. These were women whispering lullabies while mending worn cloaks by candlelight, old men telling tales by fire, monks copying the gospel one careful stroke at a time, merchants hauling goods across borders drawn by kings, but ignored by oxen. They did not seek to make history, but in living day after day, generation after generation, they became its quiet authors. In their hands lay the continuity of knowledge, belief, and daily bread. Their homes, though modest, formed the bedrock of society. Their songs, though rarely written, carried stories further than the most gilded scrolls. Their memories, passed not through ink but through tradition, shaped entire villages. They knew little of legacy. They knew much of duty. And from their tireless efforts, our world was slowly woven. Yet even within this humbler view of history, one finds beauty. Not the towering golden kind that demands awe, but the subtle kind that soothes. A mother brushing a child's hair beneath the eaves. A mason smoothing the corner of a chapel stone. A weaver choosing the perfect thread, not for fame, but for satisfaction. The way the fog clung to the fields at dawn, or how the light played through colored glass in a small, quiet church. These are the moments that history books often pass by, but they are the ones we feel most when we imagine those long-ago lives. Not battles or decrees, but hands in earth, bread on coals, eyes raised to a familiar sky. Of course, the Middle Ages were not idyllic. They carried hardship in every season. Disease, injustice, war, and famine all came with cruel regularity. Lives were short, death was constant, and yet people endured. They did not escape sorrow, but they learned to live within it. They developed rituals to mourn, to cope, to hope again. A song at a funeral, a charm sewn into a child's shirt, a candle lit each evening not just to see, but to remember. The resilience of the medieval spirit was not in denying pain. In facing it without spectacle, and continuing on. There was wisdom, too, in how they understood time. Not as something to race against, but as something to move with. They rose with the sun, worked by its light, rested with the stars. Their days were ruled by bells and seasons, not clocks. Patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Whether tending crops or crafting stained glass, time could not be rushed. They knew that beauty took waiting. That growth, whether of wheat or of character, needed tending. Their world moved more slowly, but perhaps with more care. And in that care, something enduring was born. And as for belief, it was a compass. Whether one was a devout monk or a skeptical miller, faith shaped the air they breathed. It was not only about salvation, but about structure. About finding meaning in birth, in misfortune, in the quiet march of years. God was present in illness and health, in crop and coin, in blessing and in plague. Churches were more than buildings. They were calendars, schools, shelters, theaters, and archives. They taught the unlettered through sculpture and song. They held memory in stone. They reminded each soul that life, no matter how humble, mattered in the eyes of heaven. But even beyond churches, meaning was found in place. People belonged not just to families or faiths, but to soil. Villages were more than settlements, they were identities. A grove of trees might be where one's parents met. A well, the site of stories long told. A hilltop, a resting place for ancestors. Names came from land. So did songs. The world was not abstract. It was tactile, familiar. To be exiled was not only to lose a home, but to lose oneself. The medieval soul was rooted deeply. And perhaps this is what we seek late at night, when we open books about these times and listen to stories spoken slowly. Not just knowledge of the past, but a feeling of continuity, of slowness, of connection. A reminder that the frantic pace of modern life is not the only way to be. That once, life moved like a song sung by candlelight. That once, stories were told not to impress, but to soothe. That once, people lived not to be remembered, but to remember each other. The medieval world now sleeps beneath ruins and manuscripts, beneath songs sung in dialects long gone. But its heart still beats, softly, in traditions that survived, in places still visited, in customs inherited unknowingly. When we need bread, when we gather at solstice, when we listen to bells echoing across rooftops, it lingers not as myth, but as echo. And now, dear listener, our journey draws to a close. The lights dim, the voices quiet. The centuries we've crossed fold gently behind us like pages turned. You've wandered roads with pilgrims, watched blacksmiths bend steel, listened to nuns sing in candlelit chapels, and stood in the hush of a peasant's hearth. You've witnessed the slow heartbeat of a world once feared as dark, but revealed, instead, to be rich with texture, rhythm, and humanity. And in this quiet unfolding, perhaps something ancient within you stirred, not merely interest, but recognition. Because the truth is, you've always known these people. Their fears, their joys, their stubbornness, their grace. They are not far from us. They are in us. And though centuries divide our worlds, a thread connects them still, woven through story, through memory, through the quiet, steady telling of lives long past. Lives that remind us not only who we were, but how to be still. So rest now. Let the fire burn low. Let the story settle into your thoughts like mist upon a meadow. The journey is not lost. It has only been remembered. And as the final bells toll, across our imaginary village, we do not say goodbye. We say only this: good night, traveler.